In the days of Herod of Judea, our gospel reading begins here with the specific framing of the political and geographical landscape of this story. Judea, centered around Jerusalem and the temple. Judea, politically volatile, with corruption at the highest levels, and under the rule of King Herod. In Judea, Herod, an insecure and brutally violent leader, is in power. He's a client king for Rome, a puppet given authority. He's achieved order through fear, surveillance, secret police, a network of informants, and the promise of death and retribution to any who went against him. Having executed his wife, his mother, and several of his sons, Herod's reputation for violence was real. He spent time and money on massive building projects made possible by the labor of local people who paid increased taxes to support them. In Herod's time, fear ruled the land. Under his rule and the authority of Rome, the ushering in of what they called the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, well, that was false. The people knew fear and had little hope. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Does any of it ring true? It does to me. Reading it reminds me of why I had to stop watching The Handmaid's Tale. It hit too close to home, too close to the fears I had, the fears I have for our world. We read this text and wonder if we're safe, if we're next in line, a little too close to the current victims of an unstable leader's wrath. It's why so many of us are afraid to speak, afraid to act against a leader like Herod. Like I said, it's all a little too familiar for me. But this Advent, we're asking the question, what do you fear? And each week we're unpacking that question through the lens of Scripture, situating ourselves in our current context and asking if the story of God's Son, this coming of the Messiah, Jesus, can save us from an evil king, hold our trepidation, ease our very mental and physical distress. When Luke begins with the phrase, in the time of Herod of Judea, we hear it in the same way people read it all those many centuries ago. This was a time of frustration and uncertainty, a time of fear. And people felt that fear in their bodies. Advent begins in the body, in our aching bones, our anxious heart, the womb, as it were, of each soul that feels empty, longs for fulfillment. Luke tells us right away that Zechariah and Elizabeth are getting on in years, carrying decades of unanswered prayer, experiencing the natural decline that comes with aging, living in bodies shaped by limitation. They are old. Luke uses their fully embodied story to speak to a fearful time. In the days of Herod, when fear ruled the land, Luke shows us fear at the most human level, the ordinary fear of running out of time, the fear that the prayer you've prayed for years will never be answered, the fear that your body has betrayed you, the fear that what you've longed for will never come. What better way to encapsulate the utter feeling of fear than in the story of an elderly couple longing for dreams deferred, an opportunity at the altar, the possibility of children as part of their family. Luke knows that fear doesn't just live in the mind, it settles in the body. Here he gives us a couple whose body tells the truth of the story. We are a people waiting for a miracle, one that feels way too long in its coming. So let's begin at the temple with Zechariah. When Zechariah enters the temple, it's his first time. After serving all these many years, he is finally here. This moment, too, represents the fulfillment of a prayer for Zechariah. His appointment to this task from a sacred lottery of thousands of priests was a moment most priests would never experience. But for sure, they prayed for it. So here, representative of the entire community, the entire people, offering symbolically their prayers, his body reacts. He is on high alert, performing his duty with ritual precision and for sure a helping of nervous tension. The text says that when the angel appears, he was terrified and fear overwhelmed him. What does that look like? Well, his breath regulates, either slowing or quickening. He might smell the incense, perhaps even feel its heat. Fear might flood his senses. Think heart racing, weak knees, a tightened chest, vision sharpened or blurred. The encounter lands in his body for sure. So the words "do not be afraid" name this embodied longing. When the angel says your prayer has been heard, Zechariah remembers this moment, the first time in the temple, this answered prayer, and then the others. His private heart's desire, the one he may have stopped praying for. This fear is absolutely physiological. Around here, we talk about encounter, the real you, face to face with the real God. Well, this is pretty much something like that. Zechariah in this moment is fully seen. Every desire is exposed. Those long buried hopes, they arise. They are called to the surface. We can understand his fear as tied to time. He's old. Is it too late? A man like Zechariah, a priest who knew the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who may have compared his journey to theirs, had to have wondered about the blatant absence of quote-unquote blessing in this area of his life. When the angel appears, he hears him as a man who'd lived through decades of disappointment, a disappointment that shaped his interior world. For sure, Zechariah, a priest for whom legacy mattered, at some point considered his reproductive health. Though women carried the burden for an infertility diagnosis in the ancient world, we have record that men struggled too. And though those thoughts, private though they may be, impacted everything about him. He thought about what it meant for him, for his wife, and their lineage. And it was one area that he could not fix. And right here, in this place of trembling, longing, and limitation, God meets him. And then there's Elizabeth. Elizabeth of the sacred heritage, Elizabeth shaped by tradition and ritual. She has a name and carries her own sense of spiritual authority. She is a daughter of Aaron, the first priestly family in Israel's story. Luke names her, tells us who she is before letting her identity be defined by what her body has done or not done. Her name carries covenant promise. She would become the first person in Luke's gospel to proclaim Mary's child as Lord. In my sacred imagination, Elizabeth sings too, for surely she has a song. Luke uses the womb as the symbol for every forgotten dream, every prayer met with silence. It is the site of longing and disappointment. Elizabeth knew the ticking of a biological clock. Childlessness in her world was visible. This pain was public. Neighbors talked, people whispered. It was a longing she could not hide. If the bearing of children is a woman's desire, it is most difficult to hide. In the ancient world, a woman's fertility was baked into that identity. Women who experienced this inability experienced shame and were seen as less than. Her reproductive capacity was tied to status, security, identity, future care in old age, and how her community interpreted God's favor in her life. The womb was not just biological. The womb was social, economic, and spiritual. Sadly, some of this is still true today. We hear Elizabeth's story and know that her fear is embodied. The ways of women are ancient and real, and although the men might not have understood this, the midwives did. So for Elizabeth, a woman of privilege, by this age, she would have consulted with them already. She would have used any available resources to help her situation. So every cycle that occurred was a reminder, a monthly reminder of that dream deferred. For sure, fear lived in her body. Every part of Elizabeth's day was a reminder of this thing, this unmet longing, a longing so powerful it would compel Sarah to push her husband into the arms of another woman to produce an heir. For sure, Elizabeth knew the stories too. So Elizabeth's fear was visceral. It played out in monthly disappointment, in physiological ache of a deferred hope in a body that could age out of the possibility, and much sooner than men. Would she run out of time? For Elizabeth, fear doesn't end with conception. It likely continued until the child was born. Every sign and signal, every feeling, every day of the pregnancy was a question. Is the baby all right? And the mandatory trust fall with accompanying silence. Each day was an exercise in living with even the tiniest bit of hope, the falling back and then praying to be caught, the prayer that everything would be all right. All of this is happening in her body. Underneath the joy of a successful conception was that fear and anxiety about the pregnancy, the possibility of miscarriage. It was real then as now. Elizabeth held her breath those first few months. A few verses later, we learn she waited 5 months. 5 months to talk about it, 5 months to acknowledge it, 5 months of walking with life on the inside and praying her body would safely birth this child. So this wasn't a celebration. This was caution. This is a miracle she can hardly believe. For sure, Elizabeth is protecting her heart. Elizabeth's body has lived inside this story for a long time. Her fear isn't acute, it's chronic. And it is this body that Elizabeth prayed with, this vulnerable, aching body. Elizabeth's body was the landing site for her faith and her greatest frustration, for both her spiritual and her physical longing. We know that the private heartbreak between this priestly couple makes their struggle to conceive a child even more challenging. In a world of blessings and curses, their inability to conceive a child creates a theological tension and perhaps a public contradiction. Why and how is it that this family, steeped in a line of generational faithfulness, how do they not have a child? Well, here, Luke subverts the cultural belief that barrenness means disfavor. He describes them as faithful, righteous, and blameless, to be exact. Still, their fear is collective and prolonged. I imagine they prayed, then prayed less, and then prayed differently. They watched their neighbors and relatives enter parenthood. Was this God's silence, or was God simply saying no? This kind of silence, spiritual silence, becomes embodied. It looks like exhaustion. It looks like resignation. And it sounds like that painful question, what if God has overlooked us? Their story may be universal, but fear is, and it's deeply human. Their story may not be universal, but fear is, and that is deeply human, which is where and how we meet them on our Advent journey. Their very private fear mirrors the public fear of Herod's world. Under the political fear of Herod's reign, their overarching sense of communal distress brought about by Roman occupation. Well, we see a couple wrestling with the fear that in their bodies, time is running out. Luke uses this story, placing their personal struggle inside one of political oppression. The human story under and within the imperial, and neither of them exist in isolation. They bleed and blend one into the other, the personal with the political, the private enmeshed in the public, the personal echoing the communal. This story resonates with what is happening in the time of Herod. In the time of Herod, their story connects us to the longing of a people under harsh leadership. Their story, their bodies tell the truth of fear and time. Because fear lives in and shapes us, it's heavy and gets lodged in flesh. And their fears are just a few of many. People feared Herod, but they also feared silence, shame, vulnerability, loss, death. They feared storms, harsh weather that ruined crops. They feared illness without a cure. They feared lack and war. Isn't it always like this? Underneath the crisis is life, lifing. And when I say that, I name the hard parts: the divorce, the firing or loss of a job, the diagnosis, the failed treatment. Always it's this hard thing that we're called to walk through. And it's happening in tune in time with the heartbeat of the world, in whatever state of destruction or reconstruction it may be. My point is that none of what we are experiencing is new, and that God chooses to step into the mess of it all. We have this story as a reminder. Luke knows that fear finds us. We know it in our world, our communities, sometimes in our homes, and even and especially in our bodies. So what do you fear? Luke begins here with a story about embodied fear, so we can recognize our own. He uses embodiment as revelation. Your prayer has been heard. I want to talk a little bit about that last part, your prayer has been heard. More often than not, many of us read or hear a scripture like this and interpret it to mean that heard prayer is prayer that is received and answered by God in just the way we want it to be. We have a singular vision for how God should respond, and we wait for that and that alone. But that isn't even biblical. There are so many stories in the Bible where God doesn't come through or respond in a singular fashion to faithful and fervent prayer. Think of Moses, David, Paul. Even Jesus himself could talk with you about heard but differently answered prayer. When the angel says, "Do not fear, your prayer is answered," a more faithful interpretation might be, "Do not be afraid. God is with you, and God will be with you in whatever way this thing turns out. Breathe, take my hand, we'll do this together." I've loved Mary's story, her story of courage, the power of her sacred yes, but if I'm honest, my life has connected more deeply with Elizabeth's. I've known the waiting and suffering, the personal sense of persecution that comes with questions. What's wrong with me? The painful questions about my body and its ability to perform, and to the fear of carrying the promise. Would my body, the body that had failed me so many times before, be able to change course, perform beyond the expectations from its previous track record? I've known a fear that lived in my bones, was experienced in the deepest level of my physicality as a woman, as a human in a body. In all of it, the central question remained, will you trust me? Not in the abstract, not in theory, but in your body. In the very place where fear settles and waiting stretches long, will you trust me? As for me, God responded to my prayer through adoption. My prayers for motherhood, our prayers for motherhood or parenthood, were answered in Lisha, Ela, Chyla, and a day. A day, you know, is a sweet miracle and also an answer, but his arrival wasn't the singular response to the prayer that God heard. I like to say Lisha saved my life. Ela made me feel beautiful. I'm looking at her right now. Chyla gave me peace. If the story had ended with Chyla, I had found my peace. God had answered. So even as Elizabeth's story has deep resonance areas that I share, I see how God answered for me in unique and personal ways. And the question beneath all of it was the same one God posed to me again and again, to all of us concerning all things. Will you trust me, even if life doesn't play out in the ways you planned or expected? But that fear lived in me for a really long time, and I still bear the scars of that season. Fear doesn't evaporate just because something wonderful happens. Bodies remember. And that's why Elizabeth's story matters. Her story speaks to those whose dreams were fulfilled, to those whose dreams were reshaped, those whose dreams were denied, and those who've lost any sense of language for anything as complicated as hope. Your story does not have to look like mine or Zechariah's or Elizabeth's for God to be with you, because God is. And Advent begins with bodies waiting in fear, not with an outcome secured. Gratefully, God does not shame fear. God meets it. Fear is expected. It is not a lack of faith. God says you don't have to stay in it alone. God will be with you in it. So this Advent, what do you fear? What do you fear? Walking through this text this past week has shown me that I am, in fact, not quite afraid. Or perhaps better said, my encouragement feels bigger than my fear. In the time of Herod of Judea, prophecies were being fulfilled, children were being born. We talk a lot about John and Jesus, but for sure there were others who contribute to this story of hope. In the time of Herod, Zechariah and Mary were present, so too Simeon and Anna. Each contributed to the song of hope, hope in the midst of fear. Advent always begins in the body, in tired bones, in anxious hearts, in aging skin, in hearts that feel empty, in the breath caught between fear and yearning. Luke doesn't start the gospel in the mind, he starts it in the body, a body afraid of its limits, a body afraid of running out of time. And that's where God meets us. For some, a miracle will look like conception. For others, an entirely new and unexpected path. Let's just make it plain here that not all women or men desire parenthood. Many powerfully choose to pass on the experience. God is with them too. Sometimes it's healing or peaceful acceptance. Sometimes the miracle is quiet and personal. Other times it's for you and for the whole world to see. Sometimes the miracle gives you strength to keep going, and other times the miracle says, no, stop. And none of those outcomes is better than the other, and none of them invalidate the experience you had before things shifted. A miracle doesn't mean the pain was erased. Perhaps it's simply mercifully transformed. In our own time, we have our own cast of villains who wreak havoc on ordinary life or ordinary folk. We're experiencing corruption at the highest level, with death threats being the response to those who oppose this questionable regime. For sure, anxiety is high, because fear settles in the gut, that space of deep knowing. What is unspoken, the body holds. So those conversations we aren't having are landing in the body. We're training our bodies to stay ready for the next crisis. We're braced for impact. We check the phone constantly and scroll compulsively. We aren't resting or sleeping, and it's been like this for years. Our nervous systems have been shaped by years of mass shootings, political upheaval, racial violence, climate anxiety, and social instability. We are for sure living in a contemporary version of in the days of Herod. Zechariah and Elizabeth's story reminds us that in the time of Herod, in a world of oppression and fear, God is at work and hope is alive. We meet them in our waiting, in the empty containers of our lives, in the unnamed longings, the secret desires and hopes. It could be said that we don't think our fears, We carry them in our bodies. The angel's instruction on fear is not do not worry, do not feel anxious, or try thinking differently. The angel offers an embodied command: do not be afraid. This is a word spoken to racing hearts and trembling bodies. God speaks first to the place where fear lives, to the place where fear has settled, to the place we feel most human and most vulnerable. Because that is where Advent begins, in the body, in fear, in longing, in breath. I'm going to invite us into a brief practice that mirrors what the angel offered Zechariah, with a way to meet fear in our bodies. And so this Advent, we'll breathe. Breathe in the promises of God's nearness. We'll breathe out the fear that keeps you silent, the fear that holds you hostage. We'll breathe out the fear that things will never change, that you'll run out of time. Breathe out the doubt and questions, and when you have them, still them with your breath, the quiet hush of stillness that says God is near. Breathe in hope. Breathe in love and possibility. Breathe in the courage of the long haul for however long it takes. Breathe when it feels difficult or impossible to pray. Breathe when you experience silence. Breathe when you want to withdraw. Breathe and go find you some people. Breathe when you can't find your footing. Breathe when you don't know the way. Breathe when you want to give up. This is where Advent begins, in the breath and in the body, in fear met by God's presence. What do you fear? We'll sit in silence for maybe a moment. Collect your own breath, so I won't instruct or guide you. Collect your own breath. Make that connection with your inhalation and your exhalation. Make that connection. Feel yourself. Feel that rhythm, that easy, quiet pace, that easy, quiet flow. Do not fear. I will be with you. Breathe. Take my hand. I won't leave you. Keep breathing. What do you fear? And keep coming to that breath, coming back to that breath in these next few weeks, in the spaces when you feel that anxiety coming on, the tightening of your chest, the stilling of your breath, the nervous tension, the anxiety. Keep coming back to your breath and those words, do not be afraid. In the days of Herod, God was moving in bodies, in Elizabeth's womb, in Zechariah's silenced voice, in Mary's yes, in the breath of a people awaiting liberation. And in our own day, in our bodies, in our breath, in our fear, and in our hope, God is moving still. We are never alone in our waiting. We are not abandoned in our fear. And our story is not over. Amen.